Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This episode, I'm continuing my deep dive into the history and hauntings of Fordham University, which is where I went to school. If you haven't listened to the first couple episodes in the series, that's fine. I'm trying to structure this in a way that you can kind of jump into whatever episode you want. So this episode, I'm going to talk mostly about stories of ghost priests at Fordham. I got into one or two ghost priest stories earlier on when I was talking about Queen's Court, which is a dorm on campus. But this time I want to talk about some ghost priests who have been supposedly sighted in classroom buildings on campus. And I also want to talk about Fordham's cemetery, which I mentioned last time but ran out of time when I was talking about. But last episode, when I talked about Hughes Hall, which is a dorm on campus, I talked a little bit about the filming of The Exorcist on Fordham's campus. And the cemetery on campus has a little bit of a connection to that as well. So first, let's look at the cemetery at Fordham University. So the cemetery right now is called the Fordham Cemetery. It was once called College Garden, which is a very picturesque name for a cemetery, though a little bit of a misnomer, I guess. And I mentioned this, I think, in the first episode of this series, but it's pretty well known that Fordham Cemetery has been moved once. And there are a lot of different legends about, where the bodies moved from their original location to the new location. Did they leave the bodies in the original location, which was in the New York Botanical Gardens, where the Botanical Gardens are now, etc. But actually, when I was doing my research, I found that the cemetery was quietly moved a second time, which to me is very interesting from a paranormal point of view, since so many ghost stories tend to collect around cemeteries that have been moved or like bodies that have been disinterred. So this is a cemetery that contains human remains that have been moved not once, but 2 times, so worth noting. So let's get into the history of this cemetery. So today, the cemetery, which as I mentioned before, at least in the 70s was known as College Garden, is a small plot of land on the western side of campus. It's about 20 feet long and 50 feet wide. It has a little brown picket gate with marble posts next to it and a little, fence, low wall thing around it. And the cemetery is said to contain the remains of 68 Jesuit priests. I read that there were 44 Jesuit brothers, 12 Jesuit scholastics, and 3 diocesan seminarians, or priests in training, buried there. And then there are 9 students who were buried there, who I guess died while they were in school. And then 2 workmen who, did work around campus. Fordham used to own the land that's now the Bronx Zoo and the New York Botanical Gardens, which, now are right across the street from Fordham. So as people associated with the university would die, their bodies were buried on what is now the grounds of the Botanical Gardens. And in the old cemetery, Jesuits' graves were marked by wooden crosses painted black, very goth. And when the Botanical Gardens were built in 1890, the bodies that had been buried on that land were moved to a small plot of land near the university church, and the last burial in that cemetery would be in 1909. There's a detailed account of what happened in Fordham, A History of the Jesuit University of New York, 1841 to 2003, which was written in 2016 by Thomas J. Shelley. So I wanted to read a bit from that. Oh, and it mentions a farm. That's because there used to be a farm on Fordham's campus as well. So anyway, farther east of the farm was the cemetery, located on a hilly slope that is now part of the New York Botanical Garden. The first burial took place on July 11th, 1847, one day after the death of Joseph Creedon, a 26-year-old Irish-born novice brother who had entered the society only 2 months earlier. New York City acquired the cemetery and some 26 surrounding acres by eminent domain in 1888 for $9,300. However, the Jesuits did not abandon their dead and were determined to keep them apud nos, which, this is me cutting in, I think that means among us in Latin, in the words of Father Isidore Dubresse. The following year, they rejected the suggestion to establish a Jesuit plot in St. Raymond's Cemetery and transferred the bodies of 61 Jesuits, 9 students, 3 diocesan seminarians, and 2 workmen to the new cemetery adjacent to the church. So there seems to be a clear position from the university, which is that the bodies were definitely reinterred. But historically, there has been a lot of debate about whether there were really bodies in the cemetery or not, kind of just among students, in the way that urban legends and kind of stories get passed along. It was like a fun piece of trivia that people would say where they're like, oh, there aren't actually bodies in this cemetery, but I don't think that's actually true. There are reputable sources that claim that some of the bodies may be there, but not all of them, which to me seems very likely. There's a 1976 RAM article about the cemetery where the writer goes on a tour of the cemetery with Father James Hennessy, a historian and former professor at Fordham. And just to read from the article, one of the earliest dates of those buried there was that of James Finnell, who died in 1850. Father Hennessy didn't believe Finnell's grave was actually there. Some graves were lost or moved in one of the relocations, and others have probably disintegrated by now. A later article from the year 2000 quotes what seems to be a different Father Hennessy, who is also interested in the cemetery. This time it is a Father Thomas C. Hennessy, and Hennessy is spelled slightly differently in this case. And this Father Hennessy had researched the cemetery in the Fordham archives and said, "It is not a phantom cemetery. No support has been found for the belief that there are no remains of the deceased found there." And just as an example of some of the fuzziness around the history of the cemetery, I wanted to read a little bit from an article in the RAM, which was printed on October 31st, 1985. Close by John's Hall is Fordham's own cemetery, which would be a lot more realistic if there were actually bodies there. It's said that the cemetery, consisting chiefly of young priests or men studying for the priesthood, was originally in the botanical gardens near the Bronx River when Fordham owned that property. After the university allowed New York City to use the area for the gardens, the Jesuits reportedly just moved the stones onto campus but left the bodies in their original location. Other versions of the stories say that the bodies were redug and were in such disarray that whatever could be found of the skeletons were brought back to campus, but not many of the tombs are intact. It's also said that the cemetery was not in the botanical gardens at all, and that actually it was underneath what is now the old gym. And for the record, the kind of first theory in what I just read is the closest to what I was told by other students when I got to campus. There was this story that, the university very charitably donated the land, whereas it kind of, it sounds like it was eminent domain instead. And this idea that the bodies were just left there. But I do think that the claim of there being some disarray in the human remains that were relocated, that to me it just seems plausible to me. So my conclusion from all of this is that it sounds like many, though not all, remains of the deceased are in the cemetery. And speaking of the people buried in the cemetery, some of the folks who were buried there include university presidents like Fathers Thiebaud, Larkin, and Dealey, all of whom have buildings named after them. And that's just interesting to me because Dealey Hall is a supposedly very haunted building. It's one of the buildings I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And there is a ghost on campus who's been nicknamed Dealey's friend because people believe he may have been a friend of the late college president. It's unclear to me exactly who this friend was supposed to be or whether this friend would have been buried in the cemetery, but worth mentioning. I found a really interesting article in the Fordham Observer, which is Fordham's Manhattan campus's newspaper, student newspaper. And this article was from November 20th, 2003. I wanted to read a bit from that. In addition to the myths that have persisted for so many years, ghoulish rumors lurk around campus about the cemetery. In particular, one that involves the 1973 horror film The Exorcist. During the filming of The Exorcist, the headstones started to crack, which is why they needed to be replaced, Mohammed Qureshi, Fordham College Rose Hill 06, reported. Holly Campbell, College of Business Administration 05, offered a similar account of the rumor and said that while the scenes from The Exorcist were being filmed on campus, lightning struck and smashed the headstones. However, Hennessy states in his book, How the Jesuits Settled in New York, a documentary account, that the marble tombstones, old and illegible, may have been damaged by vandals or deteriorated because of acid rain over the years. They were replaced in 1999 with granite markers. The committee's job was to find a way to secure the sacred character of the cemetery. All but 13 tombstones were replaced and can be found in the immediate right of the cemetery. Most are decaying, some chipped, and all losing their original marble white color, which makes them stand out from the rest of the brand new granite headstones. The remaining headstones were retained for historical reasons. So, this thing about The Exorcist, I find really interesting. I had never ever heard that story when I was a student. I had never heard it until I started doing research this year or maybe last year, because I've been doing this research for a little while and digging up these stories for a while about Fordham. So I think it's very possible that it's just an urban legend. But also, one thing to know about Fordham is that a lot of people who attend Fordham have other family members who attended Fordham. It's a really big, I would say it's a big legacy school, but that's usually something you would say about like an Ivy League school, like an elite university, where like you need to be related to an alumni to get in or whatever. You know, this idea that there's like dynastic families going to these elite universities. Fordham is a perfectly good school. I got a good education there, etc. But it's not the most selective school. So it's not like a legacy school in that way, but it is just a school where it was very, very common that you would meet people who maybe their parents went to Fordham, and maybe all their aunts and uncles went to Fordham, and maybe their whole family went to Fordham. And like you would know people whose siblings went to Fordham at the same time. Like it's just a school where it's like a lot of the times like people are from kind of like a Fordham family. So the reason why that is relevant here is because it is possible that a student in the early 2000s might have a family member who went to Fordham in the 70s and was like, hey, look, this really weird thing happened to me on campus back in the 70s or back in the 80s. And, you know, maybe it's a thing that didn't get reported in the RAM or anywhere else. You know, that's really the only place that someone probably would have written about something weird happening on campus. And if a person who witnessed something or had a friend who witnessed something didn't talk to a reporter at the student newspaper, then maybe it just never got written down. So that's not to say that these aren't urban legends that someone was maybe repeating. It's not to say that they maybe weren't made up by someone in the early 2000s. But just because of the kind of school Fordham is, like, just I'm thinking about people who I knew at Fordham, and a huge number of my friends had family members who went to Fordham. Like my freshman roommate, her father literally lived in the dorm room that we lived in freshman year. He lived there his freshman year, just by coincidence. I had another friend whose dad went to Fordham Prep, and like, so she told me stories about like what the prep school used to be like before it was turned into the dorm, Hughes Hall, etc., etc. So all of this to say, these stories may be BS, but also these people may have been told these stories by family members who attended, and these stories just didn't get written down. So anyway, back to the cemetery. I'm curious about where the removed headstones ended up being relocated to, right? Like if they took out all but 13 headstones, I wonder if those headstones are somewhere like in the university archives or something. Or who knows, maybe they've tossed them by now, though that seems a little disrespectful and a little unlikely. So as I was doing this research, I came across an article from October 21st, 1999 that mentioned the reinterring of the bodies in the cemetery, but it mentioned a move that I had never heard of, this second time that the cemetery was moved. So to read a bit from this article, the cemetery, which dates back to 1847, has not been significantly changed since 1959, when the bodies were moved due to the construction of Faber Hall. So I was like, that's weird. I've literally never heard of that second move. I did some more digging. I found a 1976 article that says that the cemetery was moved in 59 to make way for Loyola Hall. Loyola and Faber are two connected halls, and there are some ghost stories about Loyola Hall that I found. So I'll get to those in a future episode, but just wanted to put a pin in that. But anyway, I did some more digging. I found that the cemetery was moved in March of 1959, And I found a passage from a 1954 issue of the Ram that described what the cemetery's intermediate location looked like, the one it was in after leaving the botanical gardens, but before being moved to its current location. And interestingly, it was right near Collins Hall, which is another building that has kind of some of the famous ghost stories on campus that, again, I'll talk about in a future episode. So reading from that, when the cemetery was reestablished behind Collins Hall, arrangements included a path leading into it from the walk behind the building. More recently, plans had been made to restore the grounds and improve the appearance of the plot. They were hastened in the autumn of 1950 when a tree was upended in a storm and fell across several rows of headstones, knocking them over. Soon all the stones were realigned and cleaned, a new lawn was seeded, a new hedgerow planted, gate hung, and a brick and stone wall erected at the old opening of the path. The new walk begins from the road. The stones, of course, still face Collins Hall to the south. So that's where it once was, kind of tucked behind a building that is now the university's theater, and it also holds, I think, like the philosophy department offices. There's definitely some professors' offices in Collins Hall as well. And just as a general note, it's kind of surprising to me that the campus still has a cemetery, since space in New York City is at such a premium. And as I was researching the cemetery, I found that apparently at one point in 1970, a United Student Government presidential candidate suggested that the cemetery be used as a lettuce patch, which I actually love, and which I was going to say there's precedence for that. That's not totally right because this was written in the 70s, but I can think of a really cool historic cemetery that has been turned into a community garden, which is Moore Jackson Cemetery near me in Queens in Woodside, which I've talked about in a past episode. That was an old colonial era cemetery that was turned into a community garden maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So I think that's a really cool way to use that space and kind of bring people in to an area like a cemetery that often feels off limits and feels like it can't be integrated with like life. I don't know. I just think that's really nice, and I actually like the lettuce patch idea, and it's too bad they didn't go for it. I found one 1974 article about the cemetery that had a really fun sign-off, and, one thing worth remembering is that The Exorcist was partially filmed on Fordham's campus and was released in 1973. And like I've mentioned in past episodes, reports of ghost stories really started to appear after The Exorcist was released, in terms of at least ghost stories that were printed in Fordham's newspaper. And I think that's at least partially due to the influence of a horror movie being filmed on campus, and like some of it's probably psychological, like people are thinking about creepy things because a horror movie was filmed there, an extremely, extremely famous and successful horror movie was filmed there. But also, there are a lot of weird things associated with the Exorcist production. So there is always the question of, like, can you stir something up somewhere, like awaken something in an area where a film that is somewhat troubling was produced? Especially when there's so many connections between the genesis of the project and the place where it's being filmed. Since a Fordham professor was the one who encouraged the author of The Exorcist to write the book in the first place, which then turned into the movie, etc. And I talk more about that in the last episode about Hughes Hall. So to read this bit from this article, legend has it that the dead never rest until their graves are marked. In this case, the markers are there, but the graves are lost. Perhaps on Halloween, the restless dead will appear to reclaim their tombstones and finally rest in peace. So obviously that's just a fun, silly sign-off for the article, but it is sort of an interesting theory, and I do think the question is worth asking. Are some of the campus's ghostly priests people who might have been buried in the cemetery? And that brings us to what I wanted to talk about next, which is some famous ghostly priest hauntings on campus and encounters that people had in classroom buildings on campus, as well as the university's old library. So first up, we have Dealey Hall. Today, Dealey Hall is a classroom building, and it also includes several floors of departmental offices upstairs. I remember going to office hours up there a number of times, And when I was lucky, my classes were there. That was one of at least my preferred classroom buildings on campus. It was centrally located and not as hideous as some of the others. So Dealey Hall was built in 1867. It was originally a 5-story building built of stone in an ashlar pattern. I'm not 100% sure what type of stone it is, but I'm assuming that it's locally quarried Fordham gneiss, which is the stone that makes up the bedrock in the Bronx. In the 1950s or 1960s, they added 2 limestone-clad stories to the top of the building, making it 7 stories tall. It is not the most aesthetic addition. It looks totally different from the rest of the building. It's a totally different color, totally different style, I guess, if you can say it has a style. And, in old pictures, the building has a pretty mansard roof and a cupola on top, but oh well, there's more space there now, I guess. So I dug into the history of the building, and I found an article in Untapped Cities that claimed that Dealey is a former armory, and it said it was one of the last remaining armories in New York City. But also it claimed that it was built in 1838, which isn't true, and I found some other factual inaccuracies in the article, and I haven't been able to confirm the claim that it's an armory, so who knows, maybe it was an armory, maybe it wasn't. Probably it wasn't, but I wanted to mention that because when you search it, that is one of the things that shows up pretty high in the search results. But I don't think it's true. So like I've mentioned before, some of the earliest mentions of ghosts on Fordham's campus that I've been able to find have been from the 70s after The Exorcist came out. So I found a great article from October 7th, 1976, called Ghosts of Duane. And the writer says that they could not find a first-hand account of this story, but it was a story that was often repeated around campus. So it talks about how last May, don't know if that means May of 76 or 75, but last May, a student was at the computer center, which is hilariously capitalized, and that was in the basement of Dealey Hall. So the student left the computer center, he went upstairs to the faculty offices. It was nighttime, so no one was around, and no one was in the building except for the student and a security guard by the first floor door. The offices were all dark and the doors were locked. All, that is, except for one door, which was open. Light from inside the office streamed out into the hall. So the student went to see who was there, and he found an old priest who was mumbling to himself. The priest saw the student and told him about his experiences teaching history at Fordham, and he told him his name. And after they were done talking, the student left. As the student was leaving the building, the guard asked if he was the last one out, and the student said that there was just the old priest still upstairs. The guard thought that was kind of weird because he hadn't seen a priest go in that evening. So the guard went upstairs and there was no one there. The next day, the student asked around and found that the priest had died years before. I've mentioned in past episodes, but this is a very common Fordham priest haunting trope. I love that there's enough stories about this to say it's like a thing. But yeah, it's like a student meets a priest late at night, then finds out the priest died a long time ago. Very funny, but I'm not saying I don't believe it necessarily. There are a number of stories like this. So there's another article in the RAM called The Ghosts of Duane Continue Their Haunt from October 21st, 1976, so later that month. The article is a response to a recent letter to the editor. It was a response to their publication of the previous story from October 7th. And the article is about a grad student's ghostly encounter, or as he described it, strange happening on the 5th floor of Dealey Hall. The grad student, who in 1976 was a 1L at Fordham Law, asked not to be named, but the writer did interview the student directly, so here's his story. In January 1975, the week before exams for the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the student was studying in a cubicle that the school had for econ grad students. It was a Thursday night, and there were 2 other people on the floor aside from him. The 2 other people went downstairs to the computer center in the basement, and before leaving, they closed the door, and then they went downstairs. So moments later, the student heard the door open again and heard someone going through some papers. He assumed the others had decided to come back, and he gets up to take a break and talk to them. So he leaves the cubicle, he goes to the office, but no one's inside the office. So he goes back to the cubicle and kept studying. The two people who'd been in the basement came back upstairs and commented on how the door was open now. 10 minutes later, they went back to the computer center, making sure that the door was closed behind them before they left. The student who was still studying in the cubicle heard the door open again. He looked around the cubicle wall and saw the door swing closed. So then the student opened the door. I think this was the door to the main hallway, because at least when I was a student, there was a main hallway with departmental offices along the hall. And then when you went in the main office door, there were small offices within the larger departmental office. And the small offices housed, like 1 to 2 professors each. They had their offices in there. So anyway, the student sees an old priest round the corner of the hallway toward the elevators. He follows the priest, and to quote the student, in the corridor between the 2 wings in Dealey, a physical plant man was washing the floor. To pause, I think that means like a maintenance person. For whatever reason, they called them physical plant men, which sounds almost like a cryptid. I would love if there was a cryptid called the physical plant man, but no, this is just a maintenance person. So, to keep reading. I asked him if someone had just walked by, and he said no. I took a quick walk around the floor, and there was no one to be found. So then the next Sunday, the night before the student's exam, he was studying in the cubicle again after 7 p.m. He was alone on the floor. He heard footsteps. He goes out to see who it was, and he saw the priest who he had seen 3 days before. The priest turned around suddenly, and the student said hello. The priest asked why he was in the building so late, and the student said that he was studying for his econ exam. The priest, who introduced himself as Father John Shea, said that he taught in the econ department, but that he hadn't taught a class in 3 years. They had a whole conversation with the priest asking what level of econ the student was taking, and the student said graduate level, and the priest asked if he was getting his PhD, and the student said no, he was going to law school. The priest asked where he had applied, and the student said he had heard back from Georgetown, and the priest said, good school, I got my doctorate there. And after talking for about 10 minutes, they said goodnight, and the student kept studying. So the next day, the student told the departmental secretary that he had met Father Shea the previous evening. The secretary said that wasn't possible because, you guessed it, Father Shea had died 2 or 3 years before. So the student asked around some more. He was shown an old course catalog with Father Shea's name in it, which said that he had gotten his PhD at Georgetown. He was also told by some of the econ faculty that Father Shea had died very suddenly during exams week, the day before he was due to give an exam. Supposedly, on the day he died, another Jesuit went through his room, found the exam, and administered it to Father Shea's students, which is a little grim. I don't know, I just feel like if your professor dies, you should get your exam pushed out by a week or something, right? That seems a little intense. Anyway, the student was shown a yearbook of a picture with Father Shea, and sure enough, that was the priest that he had seen. So the RAM reporter asked around and found a faculty member who vouched for the student who told his story and said he was a credible person. The reporter also spoke to the secretary, who said that the student seemed sincere, though she said that she herself didn't believe in ghosts. She also confirmed that the student gave Father Shea's name himself before he was told about Shea's death. So he wasn't like, oh, was there a priest who died a few years ago or whatever? He actually said this person's name, and she just confirmed the stuff he said, which makes this story to me very credible. There's a person who the reporter spoke to directly, even if he declined to be named, multiple other people he interviewed about this person's story to confirm details, etc. So I think this is one of the most credible Fordham haunting stories I've seen. Interestingly, though, the student himself said, I wouldn't say I saw a ghost, but I wouldn't discount it, which is hilarious to me because I'm kind of just like, if you didn't see a ghost, what did you see? Because it's not even like it was someone else pretending to be this priest, because he saw a picture of the priest and was like, oh yeah, that's the man I saw. So if he didn't see a ghost, how did he see this man and have a conversation with him? And how was he told things that he didn't know about him? So a couple more things about Dealey Hall. This is from that October 31st, 1985 article that I've mentioned a bunch of times and that was reprinted 3 times throughout the 80s. But this was from an article in the RAM. And, I find it less credible, but it wouldn't surprise me if it kind of came from some of the stories from the 70s that are a little bit more credible. So anyway, to read from the article. While you're in Dealey Hall's computer center, be on the lookout for a benevolent Jesuit waiting to give you a hand with your program. This reportedly happened to a young student who was frantically working through the night to finish a program. Although he was the only person there and was laboring in complete silence, he just couldn't concentrate and was getting nowhere. All of a sudden, an elderly priest came in and asked if he needed help. They conversed for a while, including exchanging names, while the Jesuit successfully completed the task. The two parted, and the student handed in his project, later receiving an A for a grade. Being a good soul, the young man went to Loyola Faber Hall to thank his after-hours friend. After giving the Jesuit's name and getting a few funny looks, he was informed that his mentor had died several years before. So, like I said, I don't find this as credible as the last story. It's clear the reporter didn't talk to this person. It kind of has a lot of echoes of other Fordham ghost priest stories. And also, I just find it a little bit funny. Like, I'm not saying this isn't possible, but it is a little bit funny that, like, an elderly Jesuit in 1985 or prior to 1985 knew how to program computers. Like, I guess it's possible. Maybe back in the day, like, it was more of a hobbyist thing. So maybe if he's a technical type of person, maybe he would, but I don't know. I had always heard stories about Jesuits helping people with their Latin homework, which feels a little bit more credible than like, oh yeah, this priest in the 80s is really good at programming. But, you know, it's definitely possible. It's a fun story either way. So then, in the same article, I found a mention of something that was outside of Dealey Hall that, like, I don't really know what to make of. I found one other mention of this story, but it was from a 1996 article that was interviewing Fordham alumni, and a professor who went to Fordham during the 80s told this story. So I'm just going to read from this article. I don't know what to make of it. Probably the strangest natural phenomenon on campus is the so-called Jesus tree. Situated near Dealey Hall, opposite Edwards Parade, that's the quad on campus, the tree bears a striking resemblance to the crucified Christ. The illusion was reportedly discovered in 1979 when a co-ed noticed it as she was sitting on the steps of Freeman Hall, which is another building near the quad. Rumor has it that the young woman could not stop screaming when she saw it, and it is said that practically all of the residents of Walsh Hall, a nearby dorm, came running out to observe the figure. A few nights later, it's said that a freshman living in Roberts Plaza, or Roberts Hall in Queens Court, which I've talked about in the past, woke up in the middle of the night yelling, "They're hurting him! They're hurting him!" The young man leapt out of bed and ran across campus in his pajamas, with his roommates in various states of dress in close pursuit. Reportedly, he arrived at the Jesus tree just in time to catch a group of students painting the tree red. The paint remains on that tree to this day. These are just some of the eerie tales surrounding the legends of Fordham. It should be made clear that this story is fiction, not fact. After all, we all know ghosts don't exist in real life, or do they? So I think that those last couple lines is almost like a plausible deniability, because this is like a big long article about like, here are some ghost stories. I think it's kind of like both a like kind of ironic shield and also to be like spooky and be like, oh, we know ghosts don't exist, or do they, etc. So a couple interesting things with the story. One, interesting to me that someone in Roberts Hall, you know, the Hall of Queens Court, that I had lived in and that I think is the most haunted hall of the most haunted dorm of this very haunted campus. It's just interesting to me that this person woke up in Roberts Hall and was like, I gotta get to the Jesus tree, and had like this precognitive idea or like warning that like something's happening to the tree, and then people are painting it red. I don't know. It could be completely made up. It's very weird. The whole thing is very weird. It's so weird that I'm like, was there a horror movie or a popular urban legend or something that this is just like repurposing? Like someone looked at the tree and was like, it looks kind of like Jesus on the cross, which I already think is a very weird thing to think about a tree. And then they're like, it's just like this other urban legend. And then like this myth just grew up around it. I really don't know, but it is so bizarre to me. So I went to read from this 1996 article that I think adds to my theory that this is maybe just a weird urban legend. But it's from November 7th, 1996. It's from an article called Unlocking the Past, Bridging the Future, about kind of how Fordham has changed over the years. And there's an interview with a professor, Jude Jones, who attended Fordham in the 80s. She became a philosophy professor on Fordham's campus later on. And here's what she had to say about the Jesus tree. There always seemed to be people to indoctrinate freshmen on strange customs, said Jones. Freshmen used to wonder at the Jesus tree. Its branches looked like outstretched arms, and a knobby bump seemed like a head hung low. Blood dripped from its side, while seniors, concealing red-stained paintbrushes, snickered at horrified frosh faces. Yet this tree, located between Dealey and Hughes, lost its legendary status as its growth transformed its shape. So basically, this article / professor say basically that, like, yeah, there was some red paint involved, but it was just people pranking gullible freshmen. And that seems very possible to me too, right? Like maybe some people made up some stories about the tree and then people got like really obsessed with it. And who knows? Perhaps while intoxicated, had some experiences with the tree, had some nightmares about the tree. I don't know. It could have also happened without the influence of drugs or alcohol as well. But, you know, it is a college campus. That's definitely a possibility. So, okay, that's the Jesus tree. I would love to know any stories that are similar that people have or like theories that people have about this one. I think it's just like a weird urban legend that some people made up to scare freshmen. It's something that I had never heard of until I started researching this. Very weird. So then the next thing I want to talk about is Duane Library, which was built in 1926. This, I think, is one of the prettiest buildings on campus. Duane used to be the university's library until 1997 when a new library was built. After that, it was left, quote, locked and obsolete, as the architecture firm that worked on the building later on would describe it in their write-up of the renovations they made to the building. Then in 2004, it was converted into the admissions office. There's also some classrooms and stuff in there. It's a really cool building, which I believe was briefly featured in the film Love Story. And kind of to help your visualization of what this building would have been like. So it was the library, but it got really, really, really overcrowded with books. There just wasn't enough space for it. So I know a lot of the rooms in the building had sort of like a second story. So there would be like a wrought iron sort of spiral staircase going up to a second level that was just like added in to house more books. I had read somewhere that at one point they couldn't even keep track of what books the university had because there were some in that building. There were some, I think, in the basement of Keating Hall, which is another building on campus. And it was just like impossible to organize the books because there were just too many of them. There was no space, etc., etc. So just, you know, imagine a building overflowing with books for many years. And also it has like a real Gothic look. It has a big hall in sort of like the front. Like you walk into the building, you go up a flight of stairs nowadays, and then there's this beautiful hall that has stained glass, and it looks almost like a church or something. It even has a thing that looks kind of like an altar screen to me. And I guess worth noting too, there is a mural in that room that I think is really screwed up that depicts the martyrs that one of the buildings on campus, Martyrs Hall, is named after. I don't think I want to get super into that now. I might a little bit later on in the series, but if you want to know more about these so-called martyrs, you can check out the episode that I did about Calvary Cemetery. I think the second one that I did about Calvary Cemetery, which really focuses on Archbishop John Hughes, the founder of Fordham University, and also the guy who consecrated Calvary Cemetery here in Queens. And I do talk a little bit about the history of the Jesuits in New York. I think it's screwed up to call colonizers like the French Jesuits, who are depicted in this mural and who the Dorm Martyrs Court are named after. I think it's screwed up to depict them as martyrs because they're colonizers who were complicit in the genocide of an enormous number of people here in the place that is now the United States. And, you know, these martyrs were French Jesuits. It's worth mentioning that the Jesuits who originally took over Fordham a little bit after it was founded and, you know, made it a Jesuit university, it's worth mentioning that those French Jesuits had come from, I believe, off the top of my head, I believe it was Kentucky. And in Kentucky, they were enslavers. If you check out the book Fordham, A History of the Jesuit University of New York, 1841 to 2003, it does talk about that. And the book describes the French Jesuits as, quote, former slave owners in Kentucky. So I looked that up while I was talking just to double check that I was right about it being in Kentucky. But I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but when I am talking about the building, Duane Library, there is a not so great mural hinting at the not good history that the French Jesuits have in the United States when it comes to anyone who's not white, I guess. So anyway, Duane Library is a really beautiful building, except for that awful mural that I remember staring at a million times as a student and being very frustrated by. And I think Fordham has a little bit of a reckoning to do in a lot of different ways, but I think this hints at one of them. And I am planning to do an episode probably at the end of this series talking about some of my theories about like why Fordham is haunted. Like if there is like a Fordham curse, as some very dramatic writers in the Ram have claimed, which like I don't think that is a thing. But like if there's something bad lingering over Fordham as a university, if there's something about that spot, that area, the people associated with the university, etc., that is very negative, could that have something to do with the hauntings, etc.? Like, I have some thoughts about that. So I am planning to do an episode where I go a little bit deeper into some of sort of the less savory parts of the university. So I'll probably do that as like the last episode in the series. So more on that later, but worth knowing for Duane Library. So to get back to the hauntings of Duane Library, the story I always heard about Duane Library was that it was haunted by the ghost of a Latin professor, who was a Jesuit, who appeared on the top floor and enjoyed helping classic students out with their homework, back when it was a library. So I found this article called Ghosts of Duane, which was printed in the Ram in October 1976. So the article talks about how creepy Duane Library is, in particular the third floor north stacks. That's where a lot of the religious texts were held back when it was a library, so it was very quiet and not many people went there. And the article also says, another factor in its somewhat chilling mood is that the library keeps most of its feud texts on exorcism there. So I found that very interesting. As you probably know if you've been listening to this series, I'm very interested in all the connections between Fordham and exorcism, and I'm just like interested in Catholic exorcisms as a general thing. I just find them fascinating. So the article goes on to talk about how security guards have to go to Duane Library at night in the dark to turn off the 2 alarm boxes, which have to be turned off every 2 hours throughout the night using a special key at 12, 2, and 4 a.m. There are security boxes at the front entrance and near the door to the third floor of the stacks. And there's only one door there at the third floor of the stacks. Worth knowing. This story comes from a student security guard who wanted to stay anonymous and who had a weird experience. So this takes place in late April. It says last spring, so kind of like with the story I talked about with Dealey, not sure if that means spring of 76 or 75. But at 2 a.m., the student security guard opened the door to the third floor stacks. I'll read from the article a bit. Some light from the stairwell filtered in. He paused before putting the key into the box, which was immediately to the left of the door. The room was pitch dark with virtually no light from outside lampposts coming through the windows. Then I heard voices. They came from the area of the table near the bay windows. The voices were low, but not distinct. It was as if two people were having a conversation whispering. Then I heard the pages of a book being turned. The voices continued. Frightened, he put the key in the alarm box quickly and tore down the lighted stairwell after the alarm stopped ringing. So when the student went back next, he brought a friend. They did not hear anything. The student didn't encounter those voices again, though he once heard a voice from the upper tiers of the central hall another time, though he was less confident about that. He was very confident, though, about hearing voices from the third floor and on the third floor. And the student started singing to himself whenever he was on guard duty to feel less creeped out. Just a side note, that detail really stuck with me because when I was in college and walking around late at night, either on but usually off campus in the Bronx, I always used to sing to myself because I was kind of creeped out by the silence, because at night things can get a little bit quiet. And that was back before everyone always had headphones in all the time. So it really, anytime I was on the street and I didn't see anyone else, I would always sing to myself. So I just really loved that connection. I liked that I wasn't the only person, kind of whistling in the dark in that area when a little creeped out. So then I found another article that had a lot less detail, feels a lot less credible to me. To me, this article from 76 seems extremely credible and very interesting and not convenient the way some stories are. There was never a real explanation about who this person was encountering, who were the people whispering, etc., etc. So anyway, in another article from October 28th, 1983, in the RAM, I found a little mention of this third floor library ghost thing. So to read from that, the wandering ghost priest is a prominent motif at Rose Hill. The well-known specter, Dwayne's friend, who was most likely a companion of Reverend William J. Dwayne, Society of Jesus, University president from 1924 to 1930, can be seen floating around the theology section on the third floor of Dwayne Library. He is known to have sent late-night custodial workers screaming from the room. So I think this is kind of a retelling a little bit of that past article from the 70s, though it's kind of adding this idea that people have seen this person there, rather than just some ghosts. And I kind of I know I'm queer, so sometimes I read into things, but I really don't understand what they mean when they say that Dwayne's friend was a companion of William J. Dwayne. Just something about that feels a little queer-coded to me. I'm not trying to say that this priest was gay, but just something about it is a little weird. Just the way it's phrased is a little strange. When they say companion and they're kind of cagey and they're Dwayne's friend, it's was there some well-known person who Dwayne was friends with? Because if that's the case, why wouldn't they just call this well-known person by his name? What's going on with the story? I don't know. I'm very confused. Curious if people have theories. I know it could just be people know who the university president is. They don't know who some other random Jesuit who he's friends with is. So they'll call him Dwayne's friend. But it's just strange to me. Something about it. So the last thing I wanted to mention is that in the early 2000s and possibly the late 90s, supposedly people saw figures in the windows of Dwayne Library while the building was closed and lying vacant, and then possibly also while it was being renovated. So to read from a 2002 article that mentions it, it is also rumored that at night you can see ghosts in Dwayne Library's windows, though this made much more sense 3 years ago when Dwayne Library was completely empty and abandoned, and it was strange to walk by and see lights on in the windows. Now, of course, the lights thing doesn't seem that weird to me because they could have lights on for security reasons, etc. But I do think if you're seeing figures, maybe it's a guard, maybe it's not. it's definitely creepy if a building's kind of like abandoned, but I am fairly confident that it seems like a guard would like go through and check the place. Though, who knows? That one is like pretty easily debunked, but could have something paranormal about it. There's not enough information for me to try to make a claim that it's anything but like people seeing security guards checking the building, etc. So I was disappointed to not find like a clear source for the thing that I was always told about Duane Library, which is that like if you're in the library late at night studying, an old Latin professor, ghost, Jesuit, will come and help you with your homework. Of course, when I was at Fordham, the new library had already been built, so it's not like I was at Duane Library late at night or anything anyway. But I always really liked that story and always hoped that I would have my own story of like meeting a ghost Jesuit. But that's never really how things turn out in the paranormal, right? So that's what I've got for this episode. Next time, I want to talk about Finley Hall, which is a place that in my memory is shrouded in shadows and like a film of menacing uneasiness. It used to be the medical school building on campus. Cadavers were dissected and stored there. The scariest stories to me of hauntings are from there. And that's also where the most upsetting of my paranormal experiences occurred on Fordham's campus. There's just something to me about that building that feels like, I don't want to say evil, that I'm not trying to be like a satanic panic, kind of like, the building's evil, there's a demon there, etc. But like, there's something about that building that makes me feel bad, even when I think about it. So when I was doing the research about the building, I kept having to stop because I was getting like more and more upset. And for me, to be fair, it's not just paranormal stuff that makes me uneasy about that building, because I was living in that building the semester that swine flu hit a lot of universities in America, and it hit Fordham pretty hard. And I definitely think that I had it, but I think it also, like, I think I got swine flu, and then it caused me to get even sicker. So I was sick almost at least half the time that I was living there. So to me, I was very sick. I always felt like I was being watched. Something felt really, really wrong about that building, and it wasn't just that I was sick, And yeah, the stuff that happened to me there, I feel like is not the most dramatic thing in the world, but it's just weird enough that I've never been able to stop thinking about it all these years later. So you can look forward to next time where I talk about that awful building. But in the meantime, you can check out the show notes and sources for this episode at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can check out my Instagram at buriedsecretspodcast. You can write to me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. I especially would love to hear from other Fordham grads who have had weird things happen or know people who have weird things happen. Please send all stories my way. I would love to hear some. And if you liked this episode, please rate and review on your podcatcher of choice, but especially Apple Podcasts. Please tell your friends about it. That really helps get the word out about the podcast. And thanks so much for listening.